I think we are recording. All right. So hello, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to everybody joining us, especially Amala, who is our speaker today. So I'll quickly introduce Amala and her work to everybody. So very, very warm welcome to everyone joining us. And we are about to discuss Amala's work. Amala is an international literary scholar, and we are going to discuss her first book, Writing the Self in Illness, Reading the Experiential through the Medical Memoir. Amala is joining us from Canada, where she is pursuing her doctoral research at the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University, Ontario. Prior to this, she has completed her language assistantship at the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. And I'm very, very delighted to inform that she's also an alumni here. She has completed her master's in English with the guidance of Dr. Gayatri Prabhu at the Centre, Manipal Centre for Humanities. It is her master's thesis which has turned into the book that we are going to discuss today. It is her first book, and Writing the Self in Illness is an excellent study about how medical memoirs challenge and personalize the so-called objective, scientific, depersonalized clinical realm of medicine. Amala makes a significant contribution to the field of medical humanities and other disciplines by broadening the very category of medical memory. So it is not just writings by doctors, which a medical memoir is supposed to be about, but it also includes writings by first-hand accounts of illness and writings by patients and caregivers. Her study, based on her new definition of medical memoir, therefore, allows a wide variety of experiential narratives about experiences of illness. She argues that foregrounding the experiential holds up a mirror to dogmatic, universal, inflexible, depersonalized, so-called scientific fact. Personalized narratives also alter the language. As opposed to clear-cut, mechanical, clinical language, you also bring in the emotional or the realm of the affect, which is relevant in exploring one's journey while accessing imaginative geographies of the past. Medical memoirs offer experiences as alternative pathways and narratives to challenge what Amala calls monolithic singularity of Western medicine. It confounds the dichotomy between being and non-being, between health and illness. Memoirs, unlike autobiographies, are also very much about interpersonal relationships, whereby journeys into painful memories often do not end in neat closures. It is therefore ultimately about the process of processing pain to understand past life events through the process of writing, right? So it's the process of processing emotions through the process of writing. So that brings, with it a commitment of being true to one's memory. Self-representation in the case of medical memoirs occur through the patient and experience of the patient's illness being placed right at the center of the narrative in order to reclaim the self, the mind, the body from depersonalized medicine. The personal is therefore cast, in the case of medical memoir, in such a way that it challenges dominant perceptions of shame and secrecy as well. There is a quotation that jumps out right at the start of the introduction to this book. As we begin reading this book, Virginia Woolf's quotation comes very, very handy in explaining what an experience of illness could be about for the person as well as for the person that is in relationship with others. Quote, the childish outspokenness in illness. Things are said, truths blurted out, Are we connected?
I just think it got disrupted for a minute there, Ranjana.
Okay. Are we back?
Think so. Can
Yeah.
everybody else see and hear us?
Yes, Ranjana's back.
Yes, we can.
Ranjana, you're muted right now.
Reason internet is dropping today. Apologies about that. So the cautious respectability, about health and things that we neatly tuck away in our everyday lives kind of get blurted out. Or, they often come out and people are not sure how to grapple with them because they're so used to the everydayness of being proper and respectable. So this quotation actually right at the start kind of tells us what we are getting into. The grayness between neat lines of black and white and things like that. So Amala's study offers a window into medical memoirs and what they can do for enhancing our perceptions of illness and health. It also makes us confront tricky questions about truth, memory, ethics, credibility, and authenticity of these accounts. And the very difficult question about
Hello. Hello. Shafiq, are you coordinating this?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get
Yeah,
the
I think
internet.
Ranjana's connection is a bit.
It's dropping for some reason, and I'm not able to get into the lecture hall. So I'm hoping I'm able to finish my presentation. Apologies. I hope it stays. I'm so sorry. For some reason, there's a disturbance, and the moment we switch, I'll switch to a different room. So really sorry about that. So to go back to the discussion about confronting tricky questions and questions relating to truth and memory, ethics, credibility, authenticity of these memoirs, and the very difficult question about how certain memoirs gain celebrity. So what happens when a memoir like Girl Interrupted appears in the movie? Or what happens when a memoir like The Beautiful Boy is turned into a televised Amazon series? So the celebrity status of the memoirs and what happens to truth claims around it. Also, the fact that certain celebrity figures, their illness stories are also, in the public realm. So the public actually, they want to hear these stories. So there's also this demand, for celebrity illness stories to come into the public realm. So how do we deal with truth and truth claims of such memoirs? Scholars have called this whole process of writing the medical memoir as identity work, like Thomas Kuser, who's spoken about this whole writing of the narrative itself as constructing a sense of the self in both the writer and the reader, as the reader draws parallels with their own lives. It's also about not just a simple division between the patient and the doctor. The doctor brings with them professional detachment as well as personal involvement in many cases. But what happens when the doctor turns into the patient? So these are things which we come across in this particular study. What happens in the solitude of disease? What happens in the realm of the reflective? We also get a glimpse of how diseases were earlier, how it has been historicized over time, diseases like cancer and their treatment, the pain which comes through in the pages. Are we really then, as one of the authors, Sontag, Susan Sontag, talks about, are we really dual citizens of the realm of health and the sick? Are there two kingdoms really of health and sickness, being and non-being? These are questions that are brought out by Amala in her work. And we are going to explore it with her here today in our discussion. And her study, especially at a time when we are battling with COVID and questions of illness and self, it's such a great time to actually have a study which allows us a sense of exploration of illness and self. It also allows us to go into a journey about asking ourselves about what we consider to be health and illness, especially as we go through, COVID testing and so on. So I think it's perfect timing to have such a discussion. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Amala. So over to you, Amala.
Thank you so much, Ranjana, for introducing me and with that nuanced and generous presentation. I love that you picked the Wolf quote. It's very close to me, and it's really the quotation that I look at and think, if I had to describe the writing in one line, that's what I would look at. So I love that. I feel quite honored to be back in MC MCPH. Forgive me for saying MCPH every now and then. I'm just getting used to the change, but even virtually, and to be able to discuss themes from medical and health humanities that I'm really passionate about. And I'm very grateful for this big turnout on a Friday evening in Zoom space. So thank you to everybody who's here. I hope that by the end of our discussion, students have questions that they wish to ask, and I would love to hear from them. So let's get started.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, I think. Okay, Ranjana, can I hear your some of your thoughts and questions? And
yeah, sure. Actually, I'm really, I mean, first of all, it's such an interesting topic. So I'm really, really intrigued about, how you chose this topic, right? To look into medical memoirs. So what made you think about this topic? And I think, especially, final year BA students and MA students who are going into thesis writing, I think would also very much benefit from a discussion about, how you chose your topic and, how did you frame your research question, maybe the main question that actually turned into the central topic of your thesis, and what questions then you took to your sources, that you kept asking your sources to kind of bring out when you were looking, because it's about bringing together so many different kinds of writings, so I was just wondering how you kind of got started to begin with, and then the kind of questions that you asked to your sources.
sure, thank you so much. So I had the opportunity to take a course titled Medical Humanities under Dr. Gayatri Prabhu in my third semester of the master's program. And at the time, I knew it was a unique course, and I had never seen anything of its kind, at least in 2016 in any other university in India. So I was thrilled because of my interest from before in ideas about diseases and health. And the course sort of gave me a language, to put my ideas and about health and disease in that context and to be able to articulate them through a literary lens. So for the first time, it was, to me, it seemed that it was relevant for scholars from the arts and humanities to be able to write and think in this field. And we read some memoirs in the course by a varied set of authors, amongst other texts. And at the time, I started thinking about whether there was something unique to them, just the memoirs, right? And if there would be a connecting thread. And I wanted to propose that there's some way to read them alongside each other and gain a specific type of knowledge from such a reading. I also remember thinking, what can I read for over a year without getting tired? And the answers seemed to be life narratives or memoirs to me. And I would say that's a good way to choose a topic too. Just whatever you're passionate about reading, maybe if there's a question around that for the folks who are just thinking about this now. And questions for the sources and just writing experience at MCH. I think thesis writing is often, from seniors and everything, you think of it and hear of it as very arduous and scary. And I remember before the year started, I remember thinking how anybody could write so many words about one topic. And if you had told me then that I would be interested in writing a PhD, I really wouldn't have believed it. But I think a lot of people feel that way before that first big chunk of writing. The actual process itself was a lot easier. I mean, I had a lot of support and I benefited immensely from Dr. Prabhu's mentorship. I think at the PhD level, there's a lot more solitude in writing, and perhaps that can be productive in different ways. But when I was doing my master's, we had writing groups and writing sessions. I had the opportunity to submit several drafts and receive feedback on my writing. The development of my ideas and the course in medical humanities really helped me to run ideas by my peers as well. And my mentor read every rewritten draft, so I don't think you find that sort of writing support in most universities. And at the time, my roommates were both in the same year, so we had a thesis house, and someone was always reading or writing, and that helped too. And I did borrow heavily from the course texts in medical humanities, then branched out a little. Um, it was easy to find quite a few literary memoirs that were discussing health and disease as the main subject. And I think that has a lot to do with the turn in the 21st century towards memoir writing. Perhaps not so much directly in the Indian context. Yeah, and my main research question, I think, when I started out was uh, how these medical memoirs were responding to diagnostic categories and perceptions, both stigmatic and otherwise, about diseases. So, if there was an accomplishment in these memoirs, and what is rewarding about the process of this writing, other than say catharsis, or invoking empathy from the reader, which were both already written about. So that was the question I approached it with.
Okay. That sounds really fascinating, actually, a very, very interesting and fascinating journey. Especially, I mean, thesis writing itself is such an exploration, but your topic as well kind of, adds to it, because even in a memoir, you don't know what kind of things you're going to come across, and they're so unpredictable, and you're not sure which way your thoughts are going to go as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Also, I would like to say that everybody is welcome to add in their questions as we carry on our conversation. So either raise your hand or please speak into the microphone, but questions are very, very welcome. I was wondering also about the very, phrase medical memoir, and what made you broaden this very definition, because there's also pathographies, right, which you mention in your book, about pathos, about disease, about suffering, and these writings especially also bring in illness right at the center, patient right at the center. So what made you incorporate medical memoir as a phrase? Is it because you think medical, the term medical itself, even though it is offered as a personal narrative and a challenge, itself commands an authority, which probably pathographies, because of the word pathos associated with it, might not offer. Is that something that also was part of your decision making? That's something that I was really curious about, that you've broadened the definition, and you've put together such a wide collection of writings, not just by doctors but by patients, caregivers, different varieties. And I've seen that you've also included, letters from, as far back as, the early 19th century about cancer, and this writing about pain, where, you don't have anesthesia. So you have, someone actually scraping at the bone, and someone can feel that in the course of surgery, connected with, breast cancer and so on. So I was wondering, the fact that you expanded this definition to incorporate this wide range of sources, why did you go with the term medical memoir and not something else?
Absolutely. I think I've had time to reconsider this a few times, and I'm not as sure about the word medical as I used to be, but in a good way, in a troubling way, I think. And I found that narratives written by healthcare practitioners, especially doctors, in the literature were referred to as medical memoirs. And this was a loose definition, but there was a lot of authority sort of to go with that, right? And a doctor's medical memoir would typically share experience in a creative format about patient interaction and open it up for discussion, as you know. So I think who was writing it determined the authority, and I tried to think of how the authors I was reading were writing experience as truth. And I wanted to see how to sort of read them alongside each other and use a term that could imply authority, if not medical authority, but at least experiential and pathography. So Anne Hunsaker Hawkins, who's the main theorist in that field, classifies them into four, I think: didactic, angry, alternative, and ecopathography. And I think there's certainly a recognition of how writers reclaim experiences through such pathographies in her work, but the categories seem more rigid, and to me, they assume an intentionality for these narratives and lumps them under a broad critique. And that I think earlier on was very, very helpful, certainly. But Hawkins also uses the term pathography specifically to draw attention to how they're useful for physicians and to develop empathy. So I hoped that the term medical memoir might draw attention to the more empowering stances of these accounts. And within the broader conversations, now I'm thinking I would definitely like to align myself with the work in health humanities currently emerging, and which challenges the privileging of professional expertise over lived experience and lay perspectives. And through that challenge, widens the sort of pedagogic bandwidth for how the arts and humanities can inform multi-professional training without being necessarily led by medicine. So yeah, it's a word I'm grappling with now, I think, but for the time I was writing it in, it certainly seemed like a good choice, and nobody else had used it in that way, so I was hoping to do something there. But yeah, I've definitely had reservations about it since.
Yeah, but it sounds really, I mean, it draws your attention immediately, right? Because I think of that medical element to it, I think. Yeah, so I think, however troubling, as you say, I think I'm fascinated by the broadening and use of the term. So, yeah, so moving from there, with this issue of medicine itself being troubling, uh, because of, associations with what we call clinical scientific, clear-cut, discourses which try to neatly diagnose and fit in everything. I was wondering, you also mentioned Leonard Woolf's category, relative frankness, right? So no matter how close you are to somebody, the things that you might not be the things someone else remembers or prioritizes, or even the idea of truth that is shared between two people or more is because what is said, what is left unsaid, the silences, and so on. And what do you make? So I was wondering if narrativizing this whole realm of emotions and affect, and narrativizing experiences. It's a past which is often something we can visit, but only in our imagination, right? We can't really travel those geographies. So I was wondering, what are the troubles which are associated with approaching, the past through personal narratives, which, as Wolf is talking about, is relative and is about relative frankness. I was wondering if you could say a few words about that.
That's very brilliant, actually, Ranjana. And it's, I think, a question that's, still being debated and discussed when memoirs come out in the world. But broadly, I think there would be two types of problems. One would be the fray controversy sort of thing, where somebody poses as somebody else or appropriates an experience. So I think that is easier to figure out, and you end up finding out, and it's a more controversial sort of writing. But to the memoirists who are actually writing their experience and being recognized for that, I think the relative frankness thing, I think of this quote by Linda Gray Sexton, who talks about how writing a memoir is like coming into a room through a different door, and you know your experience, but everybody else has disagreements and remembers it differently. So I think to a certain extent, I have read it as an absolute alignment with the author or the memoirist and not questioned it too much. But there are certainly problems raised by close ones and often people disputing memory and stuff. And I recently attended a talk where a cognitive scientist was talking about memory itself and how it works over time, and um, how there are no ways to really check how true a memory is. But I thought that perhaps a useful way to read it is as if a memoirist says they can stick by their experience and this is how they remember it. Maybe that's a useful way to read it. And dates, times, events, that sort of thing, it could go here and there a little, but it's a very powerful event and its experience that's being written about. So perhaps um, I would definitely trust the memoirist most closely. But yeah, I think there is a level of relative frankness to the extent that it is crafted and it's writing that's often after a period of time. So, there are all those layers of introspection that come into it too, for sure. And I think that's part of the joy of reading them, that you both hear of the experience and also often authors might share their own take on how it feels after so many years. So in that regard, I think going back to an earlier question you had, if I could talk to these authors, I would ask them how it feels after 5 years, after 10 years, once it's been out in the world, and how it's fared, because I know that some authors have talked about revoking their work, or not, or sort of not regretting, but wondering if they should ever have published it in the first place. So I think those perspectives really add to the reading for me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's actually, it would be amazing, if we could have a follow-up where you actually go into the minds of the authors, and as invasive as that sounds, but it would be really, really fascinating, actually.
Definitely.
So,
I sometimes think of
yeah,
just writing to a whole bunch of them, and saying, hey, this is what I thought while reading, and very humbly want to know how you feel since publishing it. Because sometimes with the republished edition, I think there's a foreword or a preface that talks about that. But yeah, there's no real way to know often, for sure. Yeah, sorry, go on, Ranjana.
yeah, no, I just was going to add that, sometimes when things are in paper, even if it's just, an article or something, or an essay that we are writing, we are often changing it 100 times, right? So for something as personal, for it to go, and then, you click the send button, it's been published and it's been, out
Yeah.
there, whatever happens after that. So that's really interesting, actually. I really hope you do a follow-up study on that. So yeah,
Thank
yes,
you.
definitely. Um, uh, I was wondering about this, related to getting your work out there. I was wondering, for example, you mentioned Linda Gray Sexton and how, she managed to release therapy sessions out to the public, and how that generates a public response as well, especially if it's of a celebrity, like, Anne Sexton, who's a poet and all. So I was wondering, this whole idea of not just writing, but also the waiting you have to do to see what kind of responses come in, and the responses that they generate. If that gets connected also to how the memoir itself is perceived, because especially, for example, not just the written word, but if they get televised, like, the beautiful boy, David Sheff's narrative about his son and, substance abuse and addiction to meth addiction, or Girl Interrupted. How these memoirs, this diagnosis, Kayson's diagnosis of being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and suddenly being put into an institution, into a hospital, and how that's all this being televised. For example, I think Girl Interrupted is something I watched many years ago, and I remember it had Winona Ryder and Angelina Jolie in it, and so you have characters who are famous playing these parts, which also might have something that they are doing to this whole medical memoir of someone who is already a celebrity. So you have a celebrity's memoir and a celebrity's battle with illness coming through, either of their parent or of themselves, and how that itself gets turned into into almost commercialized commodity in a way, which is being desired by the public. It's something being demanded by the public. So what happens to this whole notion of the celebrity in relation to the personal realm of, affect, of emotion, of disease, of ideas of self, of ideas of being and non-being? Because, I mean, if it's celebrity status, you're just there, right? You cannot escape being fully visible. And that's part of not just, writing, but also any form of media, right? It's representation, which in turn means to make, right? To represent, to make it visible, as the literal translation would. So I was wondering if, the celebrity status of these things being televised, turned into movie and all of that, how that brings its own set of complications. What is lost? What is gained? So I was wondering if you could take.
Definitely. I think, to be honest, I haven't thought about it with that level of nuance that you have brought to the question, Ranjana, but I think I would. So I remember Susanna Kaysen, in an interview, I think she said that a lot of people told her stuff like nobody else has ever said these things. And she was really at the cusp of that memoir turn, her work. And she heard things like, I feel like I'm not alone, and you wrote this book for me, from people. And before we get to talking about the visual medium, I think Kaysen shared that she didn't quite have any of those intentions going into the writing, and she wanted to dissect the world and express rage and that tone perhaps she feels might have been missed out by a lot of readers. And perhaps I'm not sure if I've really seen that tone. I read that interview much later, and she says that didn't seem to register for a lot of these people. And I think the visual medium has definitely done some interesting work, especially with Beautiful Boy. And a lot of, I think, writing generally lends itself to creative interpretations when the medium is changed. I don't think I know enough here to generalize, but instinctively, I feel like the medical memoir, where the subjective crafting of experience plays with language and tone, and the time frame might be insufficient to grasp those nuances, just to start with. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of care needed, especially with representations of personality disorders or mental health struggles. And I don't know if there are too many representations out there that do that careful work, and more so now, perhaps. But yeah, I also think for the work of awareness and to let people know what it means to navigate healthcare systems in different contexts, the visual medium can certainly help. But perhaps as two texts rather than versions of the same one. I'm thinking of it that way. I would love to hear what you think of this too. I'm curious.
Definitely, definitely. I think before that, I think we have questions. I'm not sure. So we have questions from the audience.
Lovely.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I'm really happy
yes,
that you. It's my name is Shinjini. So I am really happy that you brought up the point of borderline personality disorders and Girl Interrupted, because I am diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and I looked for films on the topic, and then I found Girl Interrupted, and I personally felt very offended because I thought that the representation was absolutely inaccurate, because the I mean, like, no, so I did happen to read the memoir after that, and I felt like the film did absolute injustice, not just to the disorder, but also to the memoir itself. And I think what happens is that when, I mean, representing something which is not spoken about is obviously very important, but I think what that also brought to light is the manner in which you're discussing it. Because, I would rather that someone did not spread wrong information, rather than, trying to create awareness. But like, what path are you taking, right? Like, it's okay to, like, I would prefer someone being uninformed than being misinformed, because they have a completely different the approach is really wrong. And these are real issues that we're talking about here, because there are people around the world who suffer from these illnesses. They define our reality, they define our everyday life. So I think it's very important to be very careful, and to be informed in the way you are spreading the information. So that's the point that I wanted to raise.
Definitely.
Thank you, Shinjini.
Yeah, sorry, Ranjana. Do you
I
want
was
to?
going to say, would you like to take a few questions together, or one at a time?
Sure, we can take a few together.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
I think it was. I saw another hand.
Yes, ma'am. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to actually add on to the representation point, because something that I've personally felt is that there's a difference between medical memoirs when they come with lived experiences, and like in the case of Girl Interrupted. When we in popular culture, what happens is something that's really sad, but something that's also very common is that instead of depicting people with certain mental illnesses, with as people with illnesses, they're just painted as people with they're painted as a mass of the symptoms of the illness, and I think it's really harmful. uh, because well, to begin with, mental health advocacy still needs to, I mean, I personally feel that mental health advocacy needs to do a lot to cover the more debilitating illnesses, because for now I think that just we're still at the neuro, I'm sorry, at the neurotic. There's a whole other spectrum of diseases that are just not. I'm sorry, that are not just heavily stigmatized. People don't really have any ideas about them, and where they get that information is pop culture. So I just really think that movies and shows, they just really need to do a better job representing, and especially, and representation isn't, that representation can't be accurate if you're just having a movie with with disabled or mentally ill people there. Mentally ill people need to be a part of that process as well, because they need to have their say, because it's about them. And like Shinjini said, it's about our lived experiences, it's about the realities we have. So reducing that to the mass of symptoms, that's really not cool. So when medical memoirs need to be transformed into pop culture shows and movies, uh, yeah, that's just it. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Anything else? Or would you like to respond to these two questions first before we
Sure,
take any
sure. Yeah, I think they kind of speak to each other. So definitely, thanks, Shinjini, and hopefully I'm saying well, I didn't catch the second name, but okay. I
Atre.
think Atre, okay. Thank you so much for sharing those points. I think we are definitely grappling at straws when it comes to representations of the neurodiverse spectrum and mental health struggles. So yeah, there's a lot of trouble with this. I think what happens is a symptom is taken and exaggerated, and the hyperbole is very problematic, and it continues to be because it frames expectations and contributes to stigma rather than alleviate it. So definitely, I have to admit that I didn't quite finish Girl Interrupted, because to me it didn't seem like the memoir too much, and I just, yeah, it was another one of those movies, I thought. And I'm going to go back and finish it for sure. But I take Shinjini's point there, and I definitely think that a lot of nuance is needed if that sort of representation is what people aim to do. Yeah, and it's definitely lacking right now on the broader spectrum. The careless repetition of exaggerated things are what we find often. And I think of it also as the Bechdel test for mental health now. Like, how many times when mental health is discussed, or any sort of disability is discussed, is it a protagonist? Is it a side character? Are they moving the plot along with the disability, or are they actually at the forefront? So that is a way for me to try and figure out what's really going on with the representation. But yeah, Ranjana, let's hear your thoughts now.
Yeah, sure. Before we go there, I think Shinjini would like to add a few lines. Shinjini?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so I felt like the memoir was quite justified, because the memoir was written in a very scientific manner. Like, of course, there are a lot, because she's writing it in a very haphazard way, but at the same time, she's also included her own, her therapist's notes, and then she's added a lot of evidence, which sort of makes it more credible than the film. Like, I'm not really sure what the film tried to do, but the memoir itself seems very credible. Like, you can, I mean, as someone who, as someone on the inside who knows what she's talking about, I felt like the memoir was justified, but not the film. I'm not really sure what they tried to do with the film, but the memoir was a good. So I think, like, yeah, like, I think, maybe the meaning gets lost in translation, the intention rather gets lost in translation when you're trying to move from a novel, which is a written work, to something which is more visual. So that might be the case.
Thank you, Shinjini. Athri, would you like to add something again?
No, ma'am, thank you. It's fine. It's all right. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Yes, we have a message here from Francesca, and then we'll go to the next question. So Francesca has written Fault in Our Stars also is another example of representation and misrepresentation, both of the book and the film. So in case you would like to add anything on that.
Fault in Our Stars. I haven't read the book or seen the movie, honestly, Ranjana, so we can keep moving. Sorry, it just
All right.
the plotline description seemed enough to me, but yeah.
It was, I think, about I think teenagers and how they are battling with cancer. At the same time, they try to get better as well as they get diagnosed. Cancer comes back. It's also about the unpredictability, I think, of life, and how someone who didn't expect to survive survives, and someone who was in remission gets cancer back. And I think it also connects with what you had written in your book about terminologies and terms that are used often, to describe the body, which is again battling with cancer, or if it's cancer free, and what those terms to do to a patient and their psyche as well. So I think that's something that we deal with as well, the terminologies we come across. I would also like to quickly respond to Shinjini before we go to the next question, because this is kind of a connected discussion. Questions about how medicine and therapist, what the therapist is saying is often connected with credibility, and what is supposed to be factual often. But at the same time, there's all this rage, I think, which is there, as you were saying, Amala, in Girl Interrupted, for example, where she's battling with this rage of a diagnosis which she doesn't understand, especially, again, because of terms which are just thrown around and she's not explained anything. And, she's locked up. So I think these ideas of credibility, of truth, and what medicine does. I think there's this sociological term which is there, iatrogenesis, which basically translates as medicine as the origin of illness itself. It's not treatment, but it is the cause of, a lot of clinically kind of boxing in things, and, the problems associated with ideas of over medicalization, things like that. And I think the title of the book is Medical Nemesis of Ivan Leach, and where this is discussed. So it's about medical and medicine becoming the nemesis, and how that's the problem as well sometimes, and we often don't address it. So how what is credible also should be seen as something in flux as well. So I think that's something I wanted to add. Yes, Sri Ratha?
Yes, hi. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay, so
Yes,
my
yes.
question actually leads on from what like Shinjini and Atrey were saying, and also Francesca. So, and this is a pattern that I've noticed in a lot of like books that have been adapted into films, and especially when they're dealing with health, like for example, like other than Fault in Our Stars and everything, also most films that deal with even therapy, it's majorly misrepresented, right? Because my own experiences with therapy have been quite different from the way that that is depicted. Because mostly it's all about, oh, you've got childhood trauma, oh, there's an Oedipus complex or something like that, but which it really isn't. And similarly, and there was this one book called My Sister's Keeper, and while the book itself had showed a lot of research and nuance, the film just really butchered it. I think, as you mentioned, Beautiful Boy was again something that actually tried to sort of go out of it. Um, Again, I haven't read the memoir, so I don't want to speak, but I mean, it still seemed like a more sensitive portrayal than the other films around this time. And other examples like To the Bone, it's this Netflix movie about like this woman who is institutionalized because she's anorexic, I think. Yeah, so there's that sense of there's a pattern, like the books themselves like show some promise, show some nuance. Like there's a lot of personal inflections in them, even if they aren't memoirs. But like just something happens when it's translated onto film, and it just becomes very it plays into those stereotypes that the film itself claims to want to break. And so I was wondering if you had any insights as to why that is. Like, is it just the medium or the audience, or like, yeah. um, that's what I wanted to ask. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, Amala?
Yeah, I just want to thank Francesca and Sriratha. I'm writing down all the titles people are putting out there, and I'm adding to the things that one needs to watch and read. But yeah, I don't have too much to say about the book to visual medium translation, just because I haven't done too much research in films or visual media, and it's stuff that I want to get into along the way now, especially with its prominence for us now that we're all confined to our homes, and it's become a much bigger part of life right now. But in the more general, in the more specific sense of illness narratives, I have found that memoirs themselves are not perhaps the easiest texts or even the best text to try and translate. I do think Beautiful Boy does something interesting, and I do read the two narratives as separate, because in my head it's, if the writers given enough authority for film rights to be translated, then they must be okay with it, which to me implies that one should or try to often read it as its own thing. But I do think the points raised about representations of certain types of illness, yeah, there isn't that much done on the background or the insights that from the writers are often about both experiencing the medical system, but also the immense amount of research and work that someone puts into understanding their own diagnosis, be it psychological or not. And I think that part doesn't get captured too much, because it moves very quickly to what the illness looks like rather than what the protagonist thinks of it or experiences. So yeah, that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you so much, Amala. We actually have a response in the message box from Francesca. We are sorry to hear, Francesca, that you had your wisdom tooth removed, so we hope you feel better. And we are going to try and get to your question now. So she's raising the point about, I'd actually love to hear about this idea of memory and pain. And I suppose this validation of someone's pain or lack thereof it. So with mental illness and physical illness, people have such varying gauges for pain and varying degrees of pain and tolerance. And perhaps I'm thinking of too many things, but I find these threads quite interesting and hoping you can comment. Also, validation by authorities or lack thereof, validation sought from friends and family and their response and lack thereof. So, authority, validation, things which which go hand in hand with questions of pain and who authorizes it, who recognizes that pain, who recognizes the varying degrees of pain as well, and tolerance and things like that. So, Amala, if you would like to respond.
Sure, sure thing, Ranjana. Thank you. And thank you, Francesca, for the question. I think there's a lot of excellent work in pain theory, by theorists such as Elaine Scarry, and also responses from crip theory and disability theory about how Scarry's work is insufficient too in imagining the pain spectrum. So I think the ideas on what sort of pain is recognized, how much visibility plays into recognition of pain, be it from family or friends or the medical enterprise, how race, ethnicity, factors like that play immensely into the treatment of people within institutions, and how assumptions that are there and biases within not just medicine, but generally about pain tolerance can influence the types of treatments and protocols that are offered to people. And I think there was recently some work done in the light of current events on how tolerance of pain is perceived differently for the Black community. And that, I think, has been very harmful, assumptions about pain tolerance. And one person that I can think of who I refer to is Audre Lorde, who talks about being denied medication after breast cancer surgery, a mastectomy. So that kind of discrimination, which comes from on the more heavy, what is the direct relationship between pain and how it's perceived, and then the more, I think, subtler ways in which it's problematic to have assumptions about who experiences pain and how. And a lot of people have been writing, I think, on Twitter and those forums as well about chronic pain and living with pain every day and what that means for reality, especially if that pain is invisible and you have to constantly make a case for why you need allowances or which you are entitled to, but you're not believed, and the spectrum of disbelief on pain. So I think there's a lot of fascinating stuff when it comes to understanding pain in relation to health. Yeah.
Thank you, Amala. I think we have some time maybe for another question. I think there's a hand. Aishwarya?
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I actually want to talk a little bit about the media representation regarding disability. So around like 2 months ago, Mindy Kaling's Never Have I Ever series came out, and it blew up on the internet. It was, it was really popular. It was trending in so many countries, and there's an actually bizarre ableist storyline, in the plot. So I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone. But so the lead character called Devi, she, due to psychosomatic reason, she loses the ability to walk, and the whole misusage, of disability for just the sake of the story, and it's actually being represented in just one episode or something. And so she basically sees a crush and magically regains the ability to walk, and the whole school starts applauding, like, oh yeah, she can walk again, no use of wheelchair anymore. And I just think that was grossly misrepresented, the whole idea of psychosomatic experiences, as well as how it is not technically practical in real life. Yeah, so that's about it.
Yes, Amala?
Thank you so much, Aishwarya, right? Yeah, thank you for I was recently introduced to Mindy Kaling's work, so I am very curious to see how this has been done and why such a prominent person like Kaling has, chosen this manner of representation. But definitely, I mean, I think we that's a big setback to representing disability. To just, yeah, I would definitely agree with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amala. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, ma'am. Can I interrupt in between?
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Apurv. I could not raise my hand because there seems to be some problem on my app.
All right.
I just wanted to know from Amala about how she looks at self-censorship while writing a memoir, particularly a memoir obviously related to medical humanities. And if you're writing about something that you've suffered from, or if you're just talking about your own history, then how do you employ self-censorship, or do you not involve it at all?
That's quite brilliant. I'm not too sure, but I think writing any sort of experience probably has a level of censorship, and I think that in a very nice way ties back to what Ranjana was pointing out about the relative frankness aspect. I think even with ourselves, when we are writing, perhaps, I mean, I find this in my journal writing. I always feel like I'm writing for an audience. I mean, the audience is just me and no one else is ever going to see it, but it's not fully me, there's a level of, there's an in-betweenness there where I feel like someone else is reading it. And though the someone else is me, it feels like an outsider. So I think writing for an audience would then be so much more challenging and involve so much more careful precision, and which is why I think memoirs are worth a lot of study and engagement. And yeah, I think self-censorship definitely must play into it. I don't know how it would specifically work with illnesses, because that's, and I've been thinking about this recently, sharing the experience of any disease is very personal in a different way, because it's private information. And it, I think, I'm not sure this really answers the question, but I've been thinking about how often one imagines that the author because of the memoir. And I think it's untrue, because it's a slice of life and it's not the entirety of a person. And there is probably no text that can tell you the entirety of a person. But yeah, I've definitely deviated from the question, but I do think I've had a lot of issues with how people, I think on blogs here and there, read the memoir as an autobiography and then assume that that one experience, sort of the access to the experience that has been granted through the text, means an access to the whole person and the entirety of them. So that's not true. And I think writers work very hard to express that very carefully and in very nuanced ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Amala. I think in the message boxes, we have a couple of questions. I think Francesca would like to add that, in the Indian context as well, how the youth are slowly becoming aware of mental illness and access to resources also, allowing them to understand mental health better and so on. But she's saying that, often a common experience of many youth who suffer from mental illness is that their parents often lack an emotional bandwidth of sorts, or rather they're dismissed. So often how, often expressing gets interlinked very much with repressing it and dismissing their mental health issues. So I think that's a very interesting point that comes up here. Also, I think Sriratha adds further that without actually explaining what each number stands for with respect to their subjective experience with pain and tolerance. So again, going back to the idea of relative frankness, relative pain, and who decides who will get pain meds and who won't, and ideas of race and so many other complications that are connected with ideas of discrimination and things like that. Also, we have Dr. Shining Star Lindo, who's pointed out that pain destroys language and meaning, and pain destroys self and life word. The life world. Intense pain is an enigma. So I think, it connects with how intense pain kind of shakes us up, right? And it destroys our stable centeredness often in many ways. And how, writing actually, and I think in that way, to very briefly respond to this before going over to you for your comments on this. The memoir, which was connected with Jean Didion's magical thinking, right? How, after the loss of their daughter to coma, and I think also her husband, who collapses on the very same day due to a heart attack, and how for a year, I think she was in denial and about husband's death and things like that, and how she uses writing to deal with those times of temporary insanity and things like that. So I think how pain also destabilizes. A brief point about the Indian context. I think in your book, Amala, you mentioned about I think Siddharth Dubé's work. Is it? Yeah. About how diseases like HIV, how HIV and AIDS, how that has a lot of stigma associated with it. Just like today we can talk about cancer and things like that. HIV and AIDS are still very hush-hush and things like that. And he mentions that it's not just issues related to repression of homosexuality in an Indian context, but also how, especially if it's connected to the idea of a venereal disease or a sexually transmitted disease, then how these things get connected with, say, the idea of the forbidden, right? So women prostitutes and things like that. I'd like to point out that even in historical, like if we look back in time, there are continuities. Because often women, were, connected with lock hospitals for examination if they were connected with venereal diseases. And not often, say, European soldiers, but in the context of India, it would be the prostitute or elsewhere as well. So, how colonization and things like that, ideas of race, they all get complicated and tied up with these areas of desire, again, connected with ideas of race and ethnicity that you were mentioning. So I was thinking of Philippa Levine's work on prostitution and things like that, how, they reveal these issues about women and body and sexuality and prostitution. So I think there's other comments coming in with further ideas about how these things rob us from Francesca, how these
Ranjana, are you still there?
Okay, Amla, this is Anubhav.
Hi, Anubhav.
Okay, in between, let Ranjana come back. In between, I have a question. I think we had this discussion before, but just so that I guess you can expand on it and others can also chip in there. Uh, three works I would like to cite. Say, for example, somebody like All the Bands Played On. Of course, it's not a memoir, but there is a very interesting moment that Randy Shield didn't want to know whether he has AIDS or not, right? So there is a very interesting part of it. That's one point. Then the second one, I remember you only suggested An Unquiet Mind. And in that particular memoir, what was very striking for me was that there is a portion where basically she is talking very directly about lithium as a treatment. And there is a particular stake, like why she is saying that. And the third one is something like, say, when Althusser wrote the memoir called The Future Lasts Forever, his interest of writing or the intention of writing in the very first page is that because I've been declared insane, thereby I cannot stand in front of the law. So I have to stand in front of like the judgment nonetheless, and that this is the memoir for that. I was just wondering, beside authenticity of remembering, besides say the question of remembering as a sort of a cathartic activity, I was wondering there could also be a politics of remembering, not in terms of politics of the text, but the politics of the author themselves, you know, why they are writing. And what do you think that if there is a politics, like then how do you look at it? Like the first example could be a self-censorship, like what I think Apul talked about. So how do you look at that relationship of politics, author, intention, and writing a memoir?
Wow, I love the collection of memoirs that you referred to, Anubhav. I think with reference to An Unquiet Mind, I'll just connect that with the others. So I think that for me, the most exciting part about reading a memoir was to see how the authors were actually responding to a course of treatment, or that the discourse of that moment, the moment for them in their times, in their contexts, and how they were sort of taking a stance and responding. So, for instance, um, Jameson, she talks about having a need to combine psychotherapy with lithium. She critiques the high doses of lithium that were being prescribed because after the 1950s, 60s, very soon, I mean, for a while after that, there was a big issue with the dosage of lithium. And then she goes on to say how she cannot survive without a combination of both, right? And with Styron, I think William Styron and his memoir, it doesn't really work the same way for him. The medications he's prescribed doesn't work, but I think if I'm remembering this correctly, the time in a sanitarium helps him immensely. So what mode of treatment works as the politics of the author and how that connects to their, especially with mental health, I think the entire spectrum of conversation. And now with a lot of the anti-psychiatry movement and, you know, mad studies and emerging discourses on in those fields, I find that the memoirs are a great reference point to looking at these first voices that and came out, you know, and talked about illness in this open way and seeing how and what worked for them, while they always make the caveat that it's their experience and not directly translatable to anybody else. So the one size fits all wouldn't work at all part of it as well. And the AIDS epidemic, of course, is a whole very complex conversation on the loss that is being articulated by the writers of Friends and so many people at the same time, the government, the Reagan government's disinterest in articulating measures to support the community till it affected heterosexual people and white men primarily. So, that conversation, of course, is again who and how they're writing, with Monet writing about uh, anticipating his own uh, illness and writing about the loss of his partner. I mean, that's the sort of voice that I think is very rare. So, yeah, maybe Ranjana, you can tie it together with a coherent thought, maybe.
I think I was also thinking about ideas that you mentioned in your book about how this whole as even Dr. Anubhav was pointing out that this whole idea of remembering and the politics associated with it, but also how I remember reading in your book this idea of how this is also not just in the negative always, this whole idea of especially in the realm of mental health, this whole idea of mad genius also coming in, where it's supposed to cross over with art and supposed to kind of, you're supposed to be privileged if you possess it, because you're supposed to kind of have an access, personal access to darkness and the other side almost, this other world of belonging. Which many of the memoirists are talking about going over to the other side, be it in illness, which is very, very physically felt, like cancer where you wear away, or something which is kind of tucked away in darkness, which unless you actually probe, someone else is not able to access directly. So this idea of crossing over between art and mental health issues and ideas of darkness, I think they also get tied up with the politics of being, be it health or the non-being of illness gets complicated, I think, with expectations from artists and people, who
Definitely.
are there in celebrity status and things like that. I also noticed the chat box. I think I can see a hand. Anubhav, would you like to add something else?
No, Ranjana. I raised it before. Yeah.
Okay. All right. No worries. Yeah. Thank you. So I think Dr. Muhammad Shafiq has also raised a comment about language as an abstraction. No experience has exact words because language has to work through common nouns. Right. And then we have Harshita, who is pointing out that, common nouns, very literally in this case, because we can't develop a set of words that uniquely describe an individual experience of pain or any other emotion. So the difficulty associated with it, if you would like to respond to that. And we have a chain of messages going after that with Francesca pointing out that, we are only capable of comprehending in some relation to another thing. So about, again, common experiences. And can one really understand what individually one is feeling? And she's, connecting it with ideas that Dr. Shining pointed out. Also, we have Shinjini pointing out about, would you say that our experiences cannot be put into words because our brains don't process an experience in its entirety? Because oftentimes we ourselves unraveling different aspects of one experience over a period. And different aspects of one experience. And the idea of retrospect and things like that are being added by Francesca. And Sriratha adds finally that, to say that our brains cannot experience an emotion in its entirety would assume that there is an entire emotion to be processed. So, again, connecting to ideas of, the singular voice of singularity and ideas of depersonalized medicine categories as well. Of emotions themselves, right? The how neatly defined emotions are, but actually how complicated they are in our brain and how meshed up each emotion is with the other in our brains, not neatly categorized as fear or anxiety or happiness. They're very complicated. So how, would you like to respond to that? I'm not sure if we have any more time. For any further questions, but we would like Amala's responses first. So very curious to hear because we had a lot of responses.
Thank you, Ranjana. I have to be honest, it will take me a little bit of time to absorb all the really wonderful threads, and I feel like our audience is very bright and active and energetic, and you will forgive me for the time difference for not being as bright and energetic, but I definitely think that the entirety of the emotion conversation, I think, for me, it goes back to our discussions on the entirety of experience being assumed. And perhaps, maybe I should revise that to thinking that even with the memoir, it's in no way the entirety of that experience. It's just a slice of an experience again. So, there is really no way perhaps to access that experience for oneself and then at the next level for a reader to experience it with someone else. But I was also mulling over Dr. Anubhav's question and this idea of the politics of the writer. And I think Jameson has a section where she talks to a professional who wonders why she would ever consider having biological children and is shocked by the idea that she would deliberately pass on this trait. And her response to that, I think, is to say that she would rather be born than not. And, maybe that's the way to understand the discourse. And lately, I've been in contact with someone who's working on genetics as a very predetermined way of understanding the world and how epigenetics, is transforming that predetermined approach in the sense that the presence of a trait does not mean the manifestation of an illness. And a lot of these ideas about what is ethical and how I think perhaps how medicine is expanding the ethical play field for individuals and things like sort of criteria that goes into donating an egg, and how much there is just a fear of any trait that has anything to do with a mental health history, a mental illness history, and how that's perceived as negative. So I find that these early authors, even before these conversations on epigenetics were really in the fray, authors like Jameson talking about how they think it's an individual choice and it still should be the individual's choice, I think is very powerful. I don't know if that comes at all close, and I think we have to talk for a long time, Anubhav, but yeah, I was just thinking about that a little bit more. But love the thoughts, and there's so much interesting stuff here. I've been trying to figure out if there's a way to capture this chat and read it later, Ranjana. I don't know Teams at all, so maybe.
I think we can. Would you like to take one or two more last questions if everybody is okay with that? Yeah. I think I saw a hand by Dr. Shining Lindo.
Yes, thank you, Ranjana. This is very interesting discussion. I was just wondering, I just have one question, not mainly to Amala, but also to all of us to think that in illness, while we undergone pain, suffering, what kind of a self is this? In illness, in pain, what type of a self it is? I just have that question in my mind, which is a question also to think about.
I would love to hear thoughts from someone else, I think. But yeah, I remember a discussion recently with Nias where someone pointed out that writing and rewriting is reinventing of the self, and it's a new self that's being written into the text. And I think that gave me a lot of pause for reflection. So Dr. Lindo, so maybe that connects a little bit to your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's one.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Jacqueline. I'm sorry to interrupt. I had a question similar to Shayank sir's question. It's about the multiplicity of selves and the difficulty of viewing oneself separate from the illness, especially the multiple selves that crop up pre-illness, during the illness, and post-illness.
There's one more question, I think, Amala, if you would like to take that as well. Abhiram? Are you there, Abhiram? I think you raised your hand. I think we lost. Yes, Amala?
Sorry, I don't know why I can't remember the question. Could you repeat that again?
Jacqueline?
Yes, sure. So I just wanted your insight regarding, the multiplicity of selves, specifically the difficulty of viewing oneself separate from the illness, right? So you have all of these multiple selves coming in, how one views themselves before the illness and then during the illness, and then obviously the aftermath of the illness in terms of self.
Definitely. Okay, thank you so much, Jacqueline, right? I think. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, the transformative aspect of illness, and its challenge perhaps to that, the invincible self, especially I think for people in their 20s and 30s writing from an illness perspective, it's always a reflection also on how one doesn't imagine ever being terminally ill, chronically ill. So, and to my mind, when breath becomes air, Paul Kalanithi's memoir, it's a brilliant text, and he's just so well crafted and published posthumously. So you actually have somebody writing while they're racing towards death, right? So I think that sort of perspective really tells you something about how there is a reinvention of the self with serious illnesses. And as you said, the self before and the self during and the self after must all be, different in that sense. And how does one reconcile them, perhaps through the process of writing? Or maybe there is no need to, if that's what's felt, and there is no going back in that sense to a prior self. So yeah, I think of it as a challenge to, like, the memoir itself is a challenge to both medical science in its desire to prolong life with the best intentions, but by asking the question, what quality of life, and and under what conditions or for what price must we prolong it, and then also what it means to be terminally ill. And authors writing about that, I think, have really brilliant insights, because as you're reading it, that, say in Paul Kalanithi's case, that this author hasn't survived the book, so it's a really strange reading experience as well.
Yeah, thank you, Amala. I think I'd like to also add one single small tiny point to clarify that Kalanithi's memoir also is about switching from being healthy to ill, but also about switching from being doctor to a patient. So I think there were multiple cells involved and alterations which were probably earth-shattering, in terms of accepting, and the way that they welcome their baby before he passes away. So I think at multiple levels, identity changes, from being healthy to unwell, from being a doctor to a patient, and also turning into a father and things like that. And I think these are things that really alter worldviews and senses of self and multiple selves, as Jacqueline was saying. Yeah, so I think our time is up, I think. So thank you so much, Amala, for being with us and for such an interesting discussion. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us. And especially, I would like to thank our final year BA student, Madhura Kaur, for such a brilliant design to our poster. Because it covers, the essence of the book, especially because it merges the, cover of the book so brilliantly with how, memoirs come through that, with reading and the process of writing and things like that. So it's beautifully done. So thank you so much, Madhura, for really taking the trouble and, putting in so much of effort and thought into this. So thank you. I think I saw one more hand. I think it was Abhiram. I think we had lost him earlier, but I'm not sure if he's back. Abhiram, are you here?
No, that was just an accident, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Oh, all right. Actually, we had lost you, but we are glad to have you back. So we thought you had a question. So yeah, thank you so much again, Amala. Really grateful for this wonderful, insightful journey. And I hope that, it has helped us, bring up questions, which we are also battling with in these COVID times. So, so I think it will lead us to further explorations. And we hope that we get to read further studies, more introspective studies about entering further the minds of these memoirists, as we were discussing right at the start. So I'm really looking forward to that. And wishing you all the very best. And thank you so much again, Amala. And thank you everybody for joining us. Hope you have a great, great weekend. And see you all very soon. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Ranjana.
Thank you so much, Amala. Take care. Bye. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I also wanted to say, Ranjana, I mean, you should stop recording now.
Oh,
in the same, yeah.
Uh,
Same 3 dots.
Thank you, Shafiq. I was struggling.